Welcome to Futures Hub, the podcast that ignites curiosity and navigates the pathways to tomorrow. I'm Mia, your guide on this journey into the future, where we explore the art of foresight, community co-creation, and personal growth. In each episode, we dive deep into innovative techniques to unlock the potential to shape our individual capacities and contribute to vibrant, inclusive communities. Join us as we mine the rich landscape of foresight, community empowerment, and building bridges between diverse voices. Whether you're a seasoned futurist or just dipping your toes into the world of foresight, this is the space where we soften the impact your future shop and craft a future that's both dynamic and inclusive. Let's embark on this journey together. Welcome to Futures Hub. Hi, Futures Hub listeners. It's my pleasure today to introduce our guest, Alicia Richins. Alicia is a sustainable impact strategist who fiercely champions climate justice and hopeful futures. As a consultant facilitator, Alicia helps organizations and community groups develop impact strategies and systems and to unpack the intersecting issues of climate, social, and economic justice using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a guiding framework. Their offerings are underscored by her active engagement in the youth climate movement in Canada and across the Caribbean, as well as for her graduate education and research in ecological economics, international development, and urban planning. An experienced speaker and published writer, Alicia channels her creative energy into the Climateverse, a media platform bringing the news from parallel dimensions where humanity is taking transformative action on climate and social justice. Alicia is a 2023 Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Fellow, also known as an NGFP Fellow, which we'll be talking about later in the podcast. Alicia's work is a wonderful example of how people find their way into the foresight field through various avenues, and is also a great example of what we refer to as an artifact of the future in the foresight world, something tangible that helps you experience what it would feel like living in a different future or in a different world. I'm so excited to share Alicia's insights and views with you through our conversation, so please enjoy. Thank you, Alicia, for joining us today. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and how your journey led you to establish the Climateverse, and even just a little bit about the Climateverse as well?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me here. About myself, I grew up in the Caribbean in Trinidad and Tobago, and I've been living in Canada now for just over a decade, primarily starting from my university studies, which were in ecological economics, primarily at the graduate level. And so about me is just really trying to figure out what makes the world go round, how do things work, and after assessing how things work, how do we make them work better for people and for planet? And that's kind of my roundabout way of getting into the environmental and sustainability field. The short answer to how I end up putting together the Climateverse, I had already been experimenting with personal essays online. I'm very interested in the topic of the interconnectedness of all of our different issues and the solutions to them, and also just the interconnectedness of us as humans with each other and with the planet. And so I've been writing a lot of personal essays, creative nonfiction. And I just had this idea one day, because my ultimate dream is to be a climate fiction writer one day, to have more hopeful narratives out there about our future. And there was a week back in 2022 where in Canada we had these very two contrasting news stories in the same week. One about the Wet'suwet'en First Nations community who was trying to protect their land from the invasion of pipeline development. And they were being really interrupted, raided, arrested, and charged even by the RCMP, the Canadian Federal Police Service, essentially. And then a few days later, we had the so-called Freedom Trucker Convoy driving across the country to protest mask mandates. And they were left alone. And I was just wondering to myself, what would it look like if the stories were reversed and the Wet'suwet'en were left alone to protect land and protect our ecosystems for everyone, and it's a trucker convoy that was actually abated from their work. And so that was kind of the first inception point of thinking through this. It was very much trying to dive more into the creative fiction side of things. And I started to think about, what if I did this for all sorts of different current issues? And the last point you mentioned, what the heck is the Climateverse? It's a multimedia platform that's reporting the news live from parallel dimensions. So essentially imagining alternate realities, different dimensions and timelines that could be possible in a world where specifically humanity is taking more transformative action on our social and climate justice issues.
Beautiful. And I just love everything about your project because it brings together so many of the different pieces of work and fields that truly speak to me at a personal level. This idea of creative work, fiction, and foresight practices, media and communications. And a lot of the tactics that you're describing are actually well-known foresight practices in that you have the science fictioning where you are essentially writing about the future and it's not necessarily going off to another planet, but it's writing creatively about what our future could potentially look like if we were to project out into that space. And even the creation of this media platform is a type of artifact of the future where you are trying to interact tangibly and creating these tangible experiences and moments where you feel like you're actually interacting with a media production company in the future. It's interesting how you got into this space because you came about it from this creative aspect, from writing in this creative space, and yet you truly are grounded in some very real foresight practices as well. Did you know that you were engaging in foresight practices when you initially began writing the stories for the Climateverse? How did the two come together for you? Because I know you are a fellow with the NGFP, so you are definitely involved in that space now. Were you aware of that at the beginning?
Not at all, not in the slightest. In the beginning, this was just creative writing. It was just my first foray into, like you said, science fiction. What does it mean to start to practice writing fiction in public? It was only in sharing the idea with people and connecting with other people that I started to learn about these different applications, like what is Futures on Foresight and the whole NGFP program. There was a fellow from the year before me, Julius Lindsay, who's actually a very well-known Black environmentalist in Toronto, and we had connected. And I'm such a fan of his work, and I was telling him about my work, and I was seeing him post about this fellowship that I was like, okay, I think this is Futures on Foresight. And it was actually in putting together the fellowship application. I was like, oh, okay, so this is what this thing is about, and this is how these things are connected. And so it wasn't until really putting myself out there and learning about the different possibilities that I was able to piece that together. And now, having done an introductory course they offer in Futures and Foresight Methods, now I know that this is an artifact of the future present. And when I collaborate with people on stories, we're doing experiential futuring and these are images of the future. This is vocabulary that I never had before last October. So it's been really gratifying to have that experience and to see how even before knowing all of the different applications and possibilities of the idea, that just in continuing to follow my gut and test things out and share out in public, that these different pieces were able to come together.
When you initially started the Climateverse and these stories, were you approaching it as a creative writing exercise? Did you have your author hat on? And do
Yeah,
you
I
feel
think
like now it's
so.
transitioned to a futurist hat, or are you kind of holding both there?
I think right now I hold both because I'm still the one writing the majority of the stories right now. We can talk about future visions of getting different authors and viewpoints onto the platform. And I think even if I were to say I'm just an author, I think there's still futuring happening in there intrinsically. And so now I'm an author who has, I guess, a bigger vantage point in terms of the futuring aspects and applications of the work. And so I don't think it really changes the stories themselves. It just changes how I'm able to frame the work and how I'm able to describe the platform and really what it can do from a futuring perspective.
I do find it so interesting because of the different ways that people fall into that futuring rabbit hole, but also the different backgrounds that we can bring into. There are such diverse perspectives and diverse fields that can bring people to this space. At the same time, I feel some may find the window into foresight by following their passions in that way, but also some people can find different passions through the foresight window at the same time. And depending on how you get to one space to the other, it can change the way you develop these artifacts. So I'm curious to know, because you said you are still primarily the writer of these stories, how you choose the topics to focus on, and also what the ideation and research process looks like. And if you found that that ideation and research process has evolved over time as you've evolved the Climateverse.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that the story or the topics are chosen is really in reaction to what's happening in current news. I think particularly when trying to start a media brand or media platform, the biggest challenge is in building that audience, that community of readers. And so the initial strategy has been to talk about the things that people are already talking about, tapping into that conversation and shifting the narrative. I often say it's similar to The Onion or the Beaverton that are out there to spoof the news for giggles and clicks, but this is more about tapping into certain frustrations and anxieties that people have and giving them an opportunity to dive into their radical imaginations, to come out to a place of optimism and hope and action. These are things we can do, and these are organizations doing things to do that work. And so that's pretty much still the ideation process. Sometimes it comes down to reading current news releases. I think it's very important that the stories are still grounded in the real world. So, in terms of timelines, the story is always starting from the present day. I'm not going to say humanity stopped greenhouse gas emissions and suddenly we're on a 1 degree warming target because that's not possible from today. All of our decisions up to yesterday are held valid in the Climateverse, and it's always about what can we do differently from today moving forward based on that. And in terms of the process, I'm now starting opening up the story ideas to partner with different organizations and communities and individuals doing great work that leads to the vision of the Climateverse, of those social and climate just futures, and really helping to tap into some of the most desired outcomes that they may be thinking about, or even current news topics that affect their work and reimagining what that could look like. So starting to broaden that field, but I think at the end of the day, it's still a little reactionary. There can be some evergreen things that we come up with just for the sake of consistency in the pipeline, but it's very much tapping into what's happening right now. What are people thinking about, talking about, and wanting to reimagine today?
That leads to one of the questions that I had around political sensitivity. When you're tapping into really current events and some very sensitive topics and opening it up to future speculation or future trends, positioned as a media company, do you find that you have to take a political standpoint or political viewpoint? How does that factor into the topics that you write about or the types of futures that you forecast into?
This is such a great question because right now I'm working on drafting up the manifesto of the Climateverse, of really having a more succinct answer to this. The output of the Climateverse is very much rooted in my own personal politics as a Black feminist, as an environmentalist. I think the Climateverse is always working towards liberatory futures, futures that are inclusive and hopeful for everyone, that are prosperous, that redress past harms and oppressions and current ones, that are working to, build a world where we all have the opportunity to thrive, to prosper, to rest, to play in a way that isn't just extracting and thinking of ourselves as separate from nature. And so that kind of politic is always undergirdling everything. And I really think anybody who claims to be apolitical is lying to themselves. Like, even that is a political stance to take. It's tough only in the sense of putting myself out there in front of new audiences that might have a harder time dealing with different political issues. But I think holding to that ethic at the core of it is always going to be really important, and just trying to do so in a way that isn't shoving ideas down people's throats. I always say the Climateverse is a pluriverse in the sense that there are all sorts of different possibilities. So maybe one day I do a workshop on a certain topic and we come up with a whole bunch of different stories that are all viable in the Climateverse, and that's fine. But it's always going to be the one that works towards human rights and liberation and prosperity and ecological harmony at the end of the day.
That kind of leads to the next question too, and just in terms of reception. So what has the reception been so far to the Climateverse, to the stories in the Climateverse? Has there been a lot of that two-way dialogue happening so far?
The reception has been pretty great. A lot of people are really excited by it, keen to see more come out of it, and I'm working on the content pipeline to meet that demand. The two-way street is still a little quiet, and I need to work on adding to the story the invitations to conversation, but there are definitely interesting conversations happening. particularly even when people who aren't really familiar with us just come across a post and they assume we're a real current news outlet. And it's like, oh my gosh, fantastic, they finally did this. And I'll be like, sorry, like this is the Climateverse. Like I'm really working on making sure that disclaimer is very clear in every single piece of content. So we're never called out for being fake news because that's not the idea at all. So that's really interesting, seeing how folks tap into the issues that they're really caring about and like, oh yes, finally we got to that thing, like it's possible, and just putting it in front of folks that our imagination is evidence of what's possible. So yeah, still working on it, still tapping into it. I recently finally launched a landing page and a Substack so I can start to tap into people in their email feeds, which I'll be starting with very soon. So really keen to see the community grow.
And what has been the most surprising aspect of embarking on this journey for you?
I think in terms of your earlier question on reception, every time someone hears about it and they're really excited and they hit follow or they hit subscribe, you hear about small business owners and how they do a dance whenever you order something off their site. I feel very similarly when it comes to my platform. It's like, oh my gosh, somebody else is following, somebody else is here. It's like, oh my gosh, it's real. What's surprising are the opportunities where stories can become real in the real world, right? So one example last year was in Ontario, Canada. We had this greenbelt scandal where the provincial government had decided to take land that was earmarked for conservation and agricultural use and sell it off to developers to supposedly address the affordable housing crisis. And that was not popular. And there were a whole bunch of different corrupt practices happening in the background that led to those decisions. And so in the Climateverse in early September, I was just like, what if they decided to just repeal it? Everybody's upset. Nobody's happy with this thing. Let's scrap this decision. Let's resign this housing minister. Let's see what that looks like. And I was really nervous to post that. It was such a tense topic at the time. I think I actually even edited out the housing minister resigning from my original draft when I published. But then 3 weeks into the future, it actually happened in real life. And I was just like, see, that wasn't so bewildering. That wasn't so dramatic and far-fetched. So that's been really satisfying. And I hope that happens more from a foresight perspective of just like, yeah, we wrote these stories and they all come true because that's what we're working towards. And not to say that Climateverse futures are inevitable, but they are possible. They can be tangible that way.
I love that. There's almost that aspect of foretelling there.
Something I'm really keen to do is to continue to promote the organizations doing the work, doing the advocacy work or the community building work or whatever work required to make those stories real, so that folks can tap into like, okay, I want this future to happen. So I need to go find the right people to work with to make that possible.
The partnering organizations that you have, I love that concept of being able to point people who are reading the Climateverse content towards those organizations that can help make those possible futures a reality. How are you choosing your partner organizations? Are the ones that you refer to always aware that they're going to be featured in the Climateverse, or are you establishing these partnerships actively and then including them in this content? How does that aspect of your work look like?
Primarily, I'm tapping into networks that I'm already connected to because I've been so involved in the youth climate movement across Canada for the past few years. So there are definitely youth organizations doing cool work that already know and trust me. And so it's more so about introducing the topic of the Climateverse to people I already know and talk to and offering them this creative imagining of your theory of change. Every organization is thinking through their strategy and their theory of change and whenever they're working towards different kinds of impact. And so here's an artifact, like we say in the futures world, here's an artifact that you can have that gives you a way to creatively engage with your audiences about the future that you're trying to build towards. I'm not very picky. It's quite open. I'm happy to work with anybody working towards better futures. And I think it's a really powerful way to bridge and build communities and support. I can support them, they can support the Climateverse growing, and we find ways of mutual support that way.
That's wonderful. What are your aspirations for the Climateverse moving forward? I know you mentioned a few pieces, the partnerships, the content pipeline. I'm curious to hear all about it, all the aspirations.
All the aspirations, I have a lot.
I'm all ears.
Like a global platform perspective, I would like to have writers and editors from pretty much every continent. Right now, we're kind of limited by my perspective and the perspective of my network, which tends to be overwhelmingly Canadian, North American, maybe a dash of Caribbean. You might get a couple stories from the UK, but I'd like to really branch out in that way and start to support some community building across countries, continents, languages even. That would be really cool. I'm also working on an immersive studio. So to me, the Climateverse is like an umbrella, and this reporting from parallel dimensions is just one arm, one expression of the work. I'd also like to be working on immersive experiences that takes people viscerally into the Climateverse. So I'm currently actually enrolled in a virtual reality program, putting together my first VR game prototype. So that's slowly in the works. So one day be able to have location specific experiences, but maybe even mobile games or VR games that people at home can play with. And then just diving deeper into the sci-fi aspect of it to be able to put together different anthologies and maybe even publish novels one day that really taps into this narrative of the future is worthwhile, it is hopeful, it is prosperous. There are so many good things into the future, and we don't have to just be thinking about the typical dystopian apocalyptic narratives that we hear a lot. The Climateverse is really about bringing forward that optimism so that we can take action and move beyond the frustration of our current limitations to get there.
Oh, I love everything about that vision. When you talk about your vision and it has so many aspects to it, I just love it. And then you're talking about the future, which is infinite at this point. It could be so many different things. How do you stage and phase yourself and pace yourself so that it just doesn't feel overwhelming? What is your personal process of realizing your personal vision of the things you want to achieve, and then again, that future vision for everybody?
That is definitely a work in progress. The NJFP Fellowship partners us each with a mentor. So I'm very grateful for having my mentor to check in with and to set expectations more realistically. I think my initial meeting was like, yeah, we're going to do this and this and this and this. I was like, okay, what's manageable to get done in the next month and the next month? So really helping to scale up essentially. And using another futures method of backcasting. So we know what this long-term vision in the future is. What's the graduated process that I can build through to get there? So that's been very helpful. That's why primarily I don't speak so much about the immersive studio or the novels and the publications yet. It's really just about building up this first avenue and this first path. I'm also really interested right now because there's no revenue generation in the Climateverse just yet. So I still work in my day-to-day bread and butter in sustainability, impact measurement, climate justice facilitation and consulting. And so thinking about how to merge these two worlds, because any work we do in the sustainability space is futures work. We're thinking about the future and the future we'd like to get to. So starting to bring those methods into my practice and maybe even merging the Climateverse into my business that way so that we can start to not kill two birds with one stone, maybe feed two birds with one dish.
I love that.
Yeah,
A much
so
better
like
analogy.
exactly trying to move away from all these very violent wartime analogies we use so subconsciously every day. But yeah, just building them in tandem that way and thinking about how I can bring futures more into the center of my sustainability work. I even do theory of change workshops. So maybe one of the partners decides to hire me to do that. And then we work on this Climateverse story as an output of that, just finding creative ways to pull it all together so that we can gradually get into that ramp up from one woman show right now to maybe having a couple volunteers to maybe being able to generate revenue to hire people in the future.
That's wonderful. You've mentioned it a couple of times now, so just definitely wanting to give the nod, but could you explain a bit more about the NGFP fellowship, about that network, your experience for listeners who are not as familiar with what that would be?
Yeah, so NGFP stands for the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners, and it's a global network grounded in SWAF, the School of International Futures, and it really works with young and emerging professionals interested in the futures and foresight space. The fellowship helps a generous number of us all around the world working on different projects that tap into futures and foresight very unique ways. There are a few of us working from a storytelling perspective, some of us working from more policy, really interesting different applications. So we're able to more so tap into a network of professionals all over the world who have experience, who can help us. Like I mentioned, we get partnered each with a mentor who helps us build out our project. We get opportunities for learning. So like I mentioned, that intro course I took, it was open to the entire network, but I wouldn't have known about it if I wasn't a fellow. I got invited by the Dubai Future Foundation to attend the Dubai Future Forum last fall. And that only happened because I'm a fellow. So it's really just helping us tap into different opportunities, thinking about the futures and foresight potential of our projects. And at the end of the year, there is a pitch competition where one of us will get a healthy chunk of money to really see the project through with a bit more resource support.
That's wonderful. It sounds like you have so much on your plate. You have, of course, your bread and butter that you're starting to merge with the Climateverse. You have this networking opportunity. You're down the foresight rabbit hole, and there's lots of plans for the future. What part of all of this, to you personally, are you most excited about? Your journey, your work? What really just gets your fire going or gets you really excited?
I feel like so much of it gets me excited. I've always been Little Miss Everything, so it's hard to choose. I think thinking about that merging of things, because I had already been thinking about how do I bring features and foresight methods into my daily work practice as a consultant and facilitator, but thinking about how do I bring these almost two businesses, but how do I bring them together in a way that reduces the stress on me? It's very exciting. Writing stories is exciting and terrifying. It's been an interesting experience in terms of your own mindset and getting away from feeling shy and putting yourself out there in front of people, which professionally I'm generally very comfortable with. But something about the artistic aspect of the Climateverse makes me so much more nervous. It takes me so much longer to invite people and tell people about what's happening and how they can get involved. So I guess that's the opposite of your question, but really just getting it out there, talking to people about it, thinking about running workshops. And as I said, the merging of the two things. So I get to do the writing, I get to do the connecting with people, and I get to do the facilitation of helping people along their journeys. I think those are the three favorite things or favorite practices of mine that I'd like to keep going.
That's exciting. And this workshop piece, you've mentioned it a couple of times too, and I'd love to hear a bit more about it. So this facilitation piece, this workshopping piece, how does that look?
Well, currently in my consulting practice, it looks very varied. I've done climate justice facilitation, which looks like climate change preparedness workshops for marginalized communities. I've done education workshops around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Those are typically the ones I do the most, and that's where I've been thinking most about bringing futures in, and that's been pretty seamless. And moving forward, I'd like to start doing workshops, so look out for something in the summer, fall that is more like a storytelling workshop for the general public, anybody who's interested, or even organizations who want to put on a certain series for different communities they serve, to think about, the future and the future of their particular piece of work. One I have coming up in the spring is with a group that does cleanups along the Humber River in Toronto. And so thinking about what's the future of the Humber River Basin and the Humber River ecosystem here, and what are different ways that we can imagine that, whether we're writing short stories or painting or drawing, just giving people a tangible artifact again that they can take home. And in terms of the storytelling ones that they can plug into our platform so that everyone else can get inspiration from their future visions.
I love that. That actually segues perfectly into events or initiatives coming up that you'd like to share. And I think you've mentioned a couple of items there. Is there anything else that's coming up that you would like to share with the audience?
Just to restate the partner story invitation, that has been just tapping into my own networks, but it will be a public call. So look out for that on theclimateverse.com. So you'll be able to tap in if you'd like to join us in the Climateverse and reimagine your theory of change, or even whatever current issues affecting your community. I'd like to invite the public into that work and in creating Climateverse stories that way. And just follow and subscribe. We have a Substack you can also find at the website. Feel free to share it with as many people as possible. And that's the best way to keep in touch and keep up with all of the different updates that will be coming down the line soon. One thing that we haven't tapped into that much is the real crisis of climate anxiety and climate grief that people are facing. It wasn't really part of my original thinking around the Climateverse, but it's become a really big piece of the why. And so just thinking of that from that perspective of having this channel as an opportunity to channel that grief and that anxiety into some hope and optimism and finding avenues for connecting with community to get there and the different organizations, like I mentioned, that are doing that work moving forward.
Not wanting to gloss over that piece of climate grief and climate anxiety that seems to be manifesting more and more, and having that response and to anchor into that response. I'm curious to know how you were able to channel it in this way in your work. How have you seen that climate grief manifesting, and how you were able to anchor into this place of optimism and what that journey looked like?
For me, I definitely saw climate grief show up as pushing myself to the brink of overwork because I already work in the sustainability space. So the more I feel climate anxiety, it's like, okay, I need to just keep working and doing more and more. And so that's been the journey of recovering from burnout in terms of thinking of other ways to really replenish myself. And the creative outlet is a really big part of that. And so if there's a way that I can share this creativity that gives other people hope, I'm really excited about that. And then eventually being able to help people through their own creative process, coming up with their own stories, that just really excites me. And I think just thinking I'm a millennial and there are these Gen Zs and Gen Alphas who are feeling so constricted, so stressed out. We constantly keep hearing this narrative of the youth will save us. And I've been hearing that since the 90s. And I can't imagine how they're feeling hearing that now. I recently have done a few different speaking engagements with high school students and just hearing from them both their determination and their very specific visions of what they'd like to do and how they'd like to contribute on the one hand, and at the same time, their absolute overwhelm and the stress about making the right decision and finding the right way to have an impact. And so really trying to integrate those feelings, finding these creative outlets, because rest and play are really so key to the human experience, and it can't just be about work all the time. That's the problem in the first place. Really helping to channel that transition in our lifestyles just from this little step of creativity has been really powerful.
Yes, definitely that overarching thread in the conversation of almost climate caretaking, sustainability, rooting into that passion of creativity to create something that can be shared with others and that sense of community. Thank you so much, Alessia. It's just so inspiring, the work that you're doing, and even just how people find themselves on this futures journey.
I am just really grateful for this opportunity to chat with you, and I'm really excited about this merging. I feel like I'm at this career crossroads where I'm thinking about, okay, how do I bring this sustainability, impact measurement, climate justice stuff together with futures and foresight? And it's still a little unclear, so stay tuned, but I'm sure we're going to have some really cool applications and offerings coming out of that. And I'm really excited to see how that goes.
I feel so honored that we were able to catch you at this integration point in your journey. I truly am so excited. You'll have to come back in a future podcast and we can do that 1-year check, that look back on how is everything going, because I feel like I've caught you at this perfect time where this initiative is just starting to grow, and even just to listeners to be able to possibly be part of that growing movement. Something so new. I think that's just wonderful. Thank you so much, Alessia.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me again. It's been great. And I definitely, let's put it on the calendar. We'll have the annual check-in for the next podcast episode.
Thank you.
And there you have it, folks. Alicia Richins, founder of the Climateverse. As we conclude this episode, we've gained valuable insights into the power of storytelling to drive activism through our exploration of the Climateverse. From its beginnings to its ambitious goals for the future, we've heard about the potential of immersive media to inspire real-world change. Join us next time as we continue to uncover the stories behind impactful ventures shaping our world. With many thanks to Alicia, signing off now, your host, with gratitude and thanks, Mia from the Futures Hub. And that brings us to the end of another episode of Futures Hub. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of futures thinking, personal capacity building, and community co-creation. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback is valuable and helps us shape the future of Futures Hub. Stay connected with us on social media. You can find us on Instagram at Futures Hub. Share your thoughts, insights, and suggest topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes. Remember, the future's a canvas. Let's work on it together. As we wrap up today's episode, keep your eyes on the horizon, embrace the unknown, and continue to co-create the future. Until next time, I'm Mia, signing off from Futures Hub.